August 1942. In the suffocating jungles of Papua New Guinea, Australian soldiers were under terrifying orders to lie perfectly still and silent, while Japanese troops walked close enough to touch them. These men were not surrendering. They were setting a trap that defied every conventional rule of modern warfare to survive an impossible slaughter. But why would any commander force his men to wait until they could literally see the enemy's eyes before pulling the trigger? And that question deserves a real answer. Australian soldiers were under strict orders to hold their fire until Japanese troops were sometimes less than 10 meters away. And by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why that decision was made and what it cost the men who had to follow it. The crisis was almost impossible to put into words. Roughly 13,000 Japanese soldiers were pushing south through the mountains of Papua New Guinea. Their target was Port Moresby, the last major position standing between the Japanese military and the Australian mainland. If Port Moresby fell, Australia itself was in danger. Standing in the way of those 13,000 battle-hardened soldiers was a defending force of approximately 1,500 Australians. Many of them were not fully trained. Many of them were teenagers. And almost all of them were already exhausted, sick, and running dangerously low on supplies before the worst fighting had even begun. The mountains these men were fighting through were called the Owen Stanley Range, and they were unlike anything most soldiers had ever seen. The Kokoda Track stretched nearly 96 kilometers through some of the most brutal terrain on Earth. The ridges rose at angles of 45 degrees and sometimes steeper. The jungle canopy above was so thick that sunlight rarely reached the ground. The air was wet and heavy, with humidity sitting at 100% on most days. The mud was everywhere. It coated boots, weapons, skin, and clothing. It swallowed men up to their knees on the steeper descents. The smell of rotting leaves and wet earth was constant. At times, visibility through the undergrowth was less than 5 meters. A soldier could barely see his own hand if he stretched it into the bush beside him. This environment was supposed to be manageable with the right tactics. The problem was that the right tactics, as understood by military commanders in 1942, had been built for entirely different places. The strategies developed in Europe and the Middle East assumed open ground, clear sightlines, and predictable terrain. Artillery could be directed accurately. Machine gun positions could sweep wide fields. Soldiers could see their enemy approaching from hundreds of meters away and prepare accordingly. None of that was true on the Kokoda Track. Artillery support, when it was available at all, was almost impossible to direct through the dense canopy. Machine gun emplacements designed to cover open ground covered almost nothing in jungle this thick. The weapons worked. The tactics built around them did not. Men were dying from more than bullets. Malaria was tearing through the ranks at a frightening pace. Dysentery was so common it was almost expected. Scrub typhus, tropical ulcers, and jungle rot turned minor wounds into serious threats. Supply lines stretched across mountain ridges so steep that local Papuan carriers, the men later honored as the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, were physically carrying wounded soldiers down trails that healthy men could barely climb. The Australian soldiers fighting on that track were not just fighting the Japanese. They were fighting the mountain, the rain, the heat, and their own bodies at the same time. Into this nightmare arrived a 37-year-old man from Western Australia named Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor. Before the war, Honor had been a lawyer. He was not a career soldier who had spent his entire adult life inside a military system. He had come to soldiering later, with a mind trained to examine problems carefully, weigh evidence honestly, and find solutions that actually fit the specific situation in front of him, rather than the situation described in a manual written somewhere else. He had already fought in the Middle East and in Greece, which meant he understood conventional warfare well enough to recognize clearly when it was failing. He arrived at a place called Isurava in late August 1942 to take command of the 39th Battalion. What he found there broke the heart. He later described his new command as 300 young boys barely able to stand. These were the soldiers the regular army had dismissed before the campaign even began. Critics had called them chocolate soldiers, meaning they would melt when things got hard. Many had been fighting for weeks with almost no ammunition coming in, no fresh reinforcements, and boots that were literally falling apart on their feet. They were holding a defensive position against a Japanese force that outnumbered them by an enormous margin, and they were doing it on will and almost nothing else. The senior commanders directing the campaign from Port Moresby and Brisbane were far from the jungle. They issued orders built on assumptions that did not match what was actually happening on the track. Hold the ground, push back, maintain the line. These were not unreasonable instructions in most wars. In this jungle, followed in the conventional way, they were instructions that got young men killed for nothing. Honor watched his soldiers try to engage an enemy they could not see until it was nearly on top of them. He watched rifle fire disappear into the undergrowth. He watched men shoot at sounds and shadows and hit nothing. He watched carefully laid defensive positions get outflanked because the jungle offered so many hidden paths that no line could cover them all. And slowly, through observation and thought, and the particular clarity that comes from watching a system fail in real time, he arrived at an idea that went against everything a frightened soldier's instincts demanded. The jungle was not the enemy's weapon alone. It belonged equally to whoever was willing to use it. And the man willing to use it was not the one who fired first. It was the man who waited the longest, lay the stillest, and held his nerve until the moment was exactly right. What he could not yet know was whether frightened teenagers, barely able to stand, could be trusted to hold their nerve when a Japanese soldier was close enough to touch. The idea was simple enough to say out loud in one sentence: do not fire until the enemy is between 5 and 15 meters away. In practice, it was one of the hardest things a human being could be asked to do, and understanding why requires understanding exactly what those numbers meant in that jungle. 15 meters in open ground is nothing. A person can cover that distance in a few seconds at a full run. In triple canopy jungle, 15 meters is the difference between seeing a shape and seeing a face. It is the distance at which a soldier stops being a shadow, moving through green darkness, and becomes a person with a uniform and a rifle and eyes that are scanning the undergrowth for exactly the kind of threat that is lying perfectly still, watching him approach. At 15 meters, there is no margin for error in either direction. Fire too early, and you reveal your position without guaranteeing a kill. Fire too late, and the man is already on top of you. The doctrine Honor and his officers developed said that the window between those two outcomes, that narrow strip of distance between wasted effort and disaster, was the only place where the ambush worked. Everything depended on hitting it exactly right. The technical reasoning behind the approach was solid once it was laid out clearly. At ranges beyond 15 to 20 meters, in that kind of jungle, bullets did not travel in straight, reliable lines. Undergrowth deflected them. Dense vegetation absorbed them. A burst of fire that would have cut through an open field like a scythe accomplished almost nothing when there were layers of leaves, branches, vines, and root systems between the muzzle and the target. The jungle swallowed rounds the way water swallows stones. Beyond that, firing at distance gave away the shooter's position immediately. The flash from a muzzle, the crack of a shot, the direction of the sound, all of it pointed a finger directly at the hiding place that had taken so much effort to establish. And Japanese soldiers who had been fighting in jungle conditions in China for years before they ever set foot on the Kokoda track were trained to rush toward enemy fire the moment it opened up. Early shooting did not stop their advance. In many cases, it accelerated it, because now they knew exactly where to go. But at 5 to 10 meters, everything changed completely. At that distance, accuracy became near certain. A section of 8 to 10 concealed Australian soldiers, firing simultaneously at a patrol that had walked directly into the kill zone, could eliminate the lead element before a single organized response was possible. The Bren light machine gun, which fired 500 rounds per minute, could sweep a narrow jungle trail at that range with devastating effect. The Owen submachine gun, which Australian soldiers had been issued specifically because it kept functioning in wet and muddy conditions where other weapons jammed, was perfectly suited to close-quarter engagement. A grenade thrown 10 meters into dense undergrowth landed with a precision that was impossible from further away. At that range, the Australians held every advantage, but only if they had not given themselves away in the seconds before. The early applications of this discipline showed results immediately, even in the brutal context of the retreat. At Isarava, between the 26th and 30th of August 1942, small Australian rearguard sections, using controlled close-range fire, were inflicting Japanese casualties at ratios of 3 to 1 or better before breaking contact and withdrawing to the next position. These were not victories. The Australians were still falling back toward Port Moresby, kilometer by kilometer, day by day. But they were making the Japanese pay in blood and time for every step forward, and the mathematics of that exchange was beginning to shift what had looked like a certain catastrophe into something that might, with enough discipline and enough nerve, become survivable. The resistance to the approach was real, and it came from predictable places. Some platoon commanders found it nearly impossible to enforce the fire discipline on men whose nerves were already stretched past what most people will ever experience. The psychological demand being placed on these soldiers was almost unreasonable by any ordinary standard. Lie still, do not move, control your breathing. Listen to the enemy patrol moving through the undergrowth toward you. Hear the soft brush of boots against roots. Hear the clink of equipment. Hear voices in a language you do not understand, getting closer and closer in the darkness and the wet and the heat. And do not fire, not yet, not yet. Several early positions were compromised because the tension became too much, and rifles went off before the moment was right, lighting up the darkness and giving away everything that concealment had worked so hard to protect. The man who did the most to push the approach from individual unit practice into something broader and more deliberate was Major General Arthur Allen, who commanded the 7th Division. Allen had seen enough of the campaign to understand that the experienced men who had fought and bled on the track had learned something real, something that could not be found in any manual written before this war. He began requiring that reinforcing units receive jungle ambush training before they entered the track, rather than learning through casualties after they arrived. His support gave the doctrine institutional weight it had previously lacked. The training itself was conducted under conditions that reflected the reality of the campaign. Units practiced in actual jungle clearings. Sessions ran through the night and through rain, because that was when the enemy came. Men lay motionless in mud for extended periods, while instructors moved through the undergrowth, simulating a Japanese patrol approach. Ammunition was so scarce that live fire practice was carefully rationed. But the psychological conditioning, the building of mental muscle memory around stillness and patience and trust in the timing, was run as hard as resources allowed. What was being built underneath the tactical instruction was something harder to measure than rifle accuracy or grenade range. It was the capacity to override the part of the brain that screams at a man to act when danger is close. It was the transformation of fear from a thing that made soldiers shoot too early into a thing that made them wait one more second, and then one more, until the moment was exactly right. Whether it would hold when the enemy's eyes were visible through the undergrowth was a question that only the jungle itself could answer. The numbers tell the next part of the story, and they tell it without mercy. During the opening phase of the Kokoda campaign, from July through mid-September 1942, the direction of the fighting was entirely one way. The Australians fell back. The Japanese advanced. Every ridge, every river crossing, every muddy trail junction seemed to belong to the enemy by the time the sun went down. Port Moresby felt less like a destination to be defended and more like a countdown. Commanders in Brisbane and Melbourne were receiving reports that made the situation sound close to hopeless, and in many ways it was. The 1,500 men on the track were fighting 13,000. The arithmetic alone should have ended it quickly. Then something shifted. By late September and into October 1942, as Australian reinforcements arrived already trained in close-range fire discipline, the nature of the engagements began to change in ways that showed up clearly in the casualty reports coming from both sides. Japanese battle logs, captured later and translated, began describing something their officers struggled to explain. Patrols were walking into positions they could not detect and being destroyed before they could respond. Jungle that had appeared completely empty was suddenly erupting with coordinated fire from multiple directions at point-blank range. The Australians seemed to materialize from the earth itself. One translated report described Australian concealment as supernatural, which is a remarkable word to find in a military document, and it tells you something important about what the close-range discipline looked like from the other side of the ambush. The Battle of Oivi-Gorari in November 1942 brought the full weight of what had been built on the Kokoda track into one devastating result. Australian forces managed to encircle the retreating remnants of General Hori's South Seas Detachment, the same force that had pushed so confidently south through the mountains just weeks before. Of approximately 5,000 Japanese troops attempting to retreat north, fewer than 1,000 reached safety. Horii himself drowned trying to cross the Kumusi River. The Japanese suffered an estimated 5,700 casualties across the full Kokoda campaign, compared to approximately 2,165 Australian casualties. That shift in ratio did not happen by accident. It was built in jungle clearings during night training sessions, in the mud of ambush positions, and in the minds of young men who learned to wait when everything inside them screamed to fire. The opposition to the approach did not disappear simply because it was working. Some senior officers, men whose understanding of warfare had been formed in open desert or on European fields, continued to view close-range ambush discipline with suspicion. The word ambush carried a weight that made certain commanders uncomfortable, as though there was something improper about letting an enemy walk into a trap rather than meeting him in a straight fight. This was not a small cultural obstacle. Military institutions build their identity around certain ideas of how a proper soldier behaves, and a doctrine that required lying silently in mud while the enemy walked within arm's reach did not fit cleanly into those ideas, regardless of how well it worked. The comparison with American units operating in similar terrain during the same period was difficult to ignore. At Guadalcanal, where American forces were fighting Japanese troops in jungle conditions that closely resembled Papua New Guinea, a pattern emerged in the early engagements that Australian liaison officers noted with concern. American soldiers, trained in a doctrine that emphasized firepower and aggressive forward action, were frequently opening fire at distances where their rounds were being absorbed by vegetation, revealing their positions without achieving meaningful results. The phrase that appeared more than once in Australian officer accounts from this period described American troops as shooting at jungle sounds. It was not a criticism of their courage, which was beyond question. It was a description of what happens when excellent soldiers apply doctrine built for one environment to a completely different one. The sounds of a Kokoda ambush, recalled across dozens of veteran accounts, follow a pattern that is almost ritualistic in its detail. It begins with smell. The rot of the jungle floor, thick and sweet in a way that is almost sickening, mixed with the fungal dampness of wood breaking down in permanent moisture. Then comes something metallic and sharp underneath it all, the smell of fear itself, the kind that soaks into clothing and does not leave. Then the sounds begin. Boots finding purchase on roots, the soft mechanical sound of equipment shifting against a body in motion, breathing, slightly heavier than normal because the trail climbs and the pack is heavy. Sometimes voices, low and clipped, the words meaningless, but the tone carrying information about confidence and direction and distance. And through all of it, the Australians lying in the undergrowth are controlling their own breathing, feeling their hearts working so hard it seems impossible that the sound cannot be heard, pressing their bodies into the wet earth and becoming, through pure will, part of the jungle itself. Then a shape, then a uniform, then a face, close enough to see the expression on it. Private Philip Roden of the 225th Battalion said it plainly after the war. You would see their eyes before you fired. That is what nobody tells you. You would see their eyes. That single sentence contains more information about what close-range fire discipline actually demanded of ordinary men than any tactical manual ever written. The scale of adoption grew steadily through 1943 and into 1944. The Salamaua campaign, running from April through September of 1943, saw Australian units consistently applying ambush discipline across operations in terrain that continued to favor patient, concealed defenders over forces relying on distance and firepower. The Huon Peninsula campaign extended the same approach further, with units now carrying the doctrine as established practice rather than improvised response. The close-range engagement framework had completed its transformation from emergency invention to transferable method, carried in the minds and muscle memory of men who had learned it where it mattered most. What had begun as a desperate survival response on a single mountain track was quietly becoming something far larger. A new way of understanding how patient men, in the right place at the right moment, could turn an environment that should have destroyed them into a weapon that protected them instead. The full meaning of that transformation would only become clear in the years that followed, when the fighting was over and the men who had survived it began building the institutions that would carry what they had learned into a future they could not yet see. August 1945 came. The surrender documents were signed, and the guns went quiet across the Pacific. But the jungle had given these men something that peace could not take back. The close-range fire discipline that Ralph Honor's exhausted teenagers had developed from necessity, that Major General Allen had pushed into formal training, and that had spread through Australian jungle units like a language learned under fire, did not get packed away with the rifles and the webbing and the Owen submachine guns when the soldiers came home. It moved with the men who carried it, quietly, the way important knowledge always moves, embedded in the bodies and instincts of people who learned it the hardest possible way. And when the next jungle war came, it was ready. The Malayan emergency began in 1948, 3 years after the Japanese surrender. British and Commonwealth forces, including Australian units, were sent into jungle terrain in Malaya to fight a communist insurgency that had made the deep forest its home. The environment was startlingly familiar to anyone who had served on the Kokoda track. Triple canopy, permanent humidity, visibility measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters. An enemy that moved through undergrowth with patience and knowledge, and had no intention of standing in an open field, waiting to be engaged by conventional tactics. For soldiers who had never set foot in Papua New Guinea, the Malayan jungle was a new and disorienting challenge. For Australian veterans and the units they had trained, it felt like a language they already spoke. Close-range ambush discipline did not need to be rediscovered in Malaya. It was applied. The patience required to lie still in equatorial heat for hours while waiting for an enemy patrol to enter a kill zone. The fire discipline required to hold until the moment was exactly right. The understanding that the jungle belonged to whoever was willing to use it rather than whoever was trying to fight through it. All of it transferred directly from the lessons written in mud and blood on the Owen Stanley Range. British commanders working alongside Australian units during the emergency made explicit note of what they were observing. Australian jungle competence, they reported, was influencing the shape of Commonwealth counterinsurgency practice in ways that extended well beyond individual engagements. What had begun as an improvised survival response to an impossible situation in 1942 had become, by the early 1950s, a professional inheritance passed deliberately from one generation of soldiers to the next. When Australian forces later served in Vietnam, the same inheritance traveled with them. American commanders who worked alongside Australian units in Phuoc Tuy province noted a quality in Australian jungle operations that was difficult to define but impossible to miss. A patience, a willingness to move slowly, to lie still, to trust the ambush rather than the firefight, to let the enemy come rather than pushing noisily toward him and hoping firepower would settle the difference. American forces were not lacking in courage or capability, but the doctrinal culture that shaped their approach to jungle warfare had been built around different assumptions, and those assumptions showed in the outcomes. The gap between the two approaches was not a gap in bravery. It was a gap in institutional memory, and institutional memory is built over years and decades by the specific experiences that a military chooses to learn from and preserve. Australia had chosen to learn from Kokoda. Ralph Honor came home from the war and returned to law. He did not seek fame, and he did not find it quickly. The recognition that came to him arrived slowly, in the measured way that recognition tends to reach people who were too busy doing necessary things to perform them publicly. He was eventually appointed a Companion of the Order of Australia, a formal acknowledgement that a life was lived in meaningful service to something larger than personal gain. Veterans who knew him described a man who carried the weight of Kokoda quietly, who spoke about the young men he commanded with a reverence that never faded, and who understood without needing to say it plainly that the real story of what happened on that track belonged to the 300 boys who had barely been able to stand when he first saw them. Those boys, the 39th Battalion, the chocolate soldiers who had been publicly dismissed by their own army before a single shot was fired, waited 62 years for formal recognition. The unit citation for gallantry was awarded to them in 2004. 62 years. Many of the men who earned it were dead before Australia found the words to say officially what anyone who had studied the campaign understood immediately. That delay is not a footnote. It is part of the story because it tells you something true and uncomfortable about how institutions relate to the people who save them. The men who do the most desperate and necessary work in the worst conditions are frequently the last to receive acknowledgement from the systems they protected, and sometimes they never receive it at all. The Kokoda track is walked today by thousands of Australians every year. They go for different reasons. Some go to understand history. Some go to test themselves against the terrain that tested their grandfathers. Some go because a name on a family tree leads them there, because a great uncle or a grandfather made it across those ridges, or did not, and the living feel an obligation to walk where the dead walked. What they find, almost without exception, is that the jungle has not softened. The mud is still there, the angles are still brutal, the humidity still settles on the skin like a weight that cannot be lifted. The Kokoda track does not perform its difficulty for visitors. It simply is what it always was, indifferent and absolute, and standing in it gives a person a physical understanding of what those young men faced that no book or documentary can fully provide. The lesson underneath all the tactics and numbers and campaigns is not complicated, but it is genuinely hard. It is the lesson that effective action sometimes requires the discipline to do nothing, to be still when every nerve is screaming for movement, to trust a plan that feels unbearable in the moment of its execution, to wait one more second when waiting feels like dying. That lesson was learned in a specific jungle, in a specific war, by specific young men who had been told they probably could not fight. They learned it because they had no other choice, and in learning it they created something that outlasted the war, outlasted most of them, and continues to shape how soldiers are trained to move and think and wait in difficult terrain today. The jungle does not reward noise, it rewards patience. It rewards the person willing to become still enough, quiet enough, and disciplined enough to let the moment come to them rather than chasing it into the dark. Those young Australians understood that. They understood it at 19 years old, in the mud, in the rain, watching a shape become a face at 10 meters and holding their breath for one more second. That is not a small thing. That is, in the most honest sense of the word, wisdom, and it was earned at a price that should never be forgotten.